Do you not care that we are perishing? Those are the words that the disciples say to Jesus as they struggle to keep their boat afloat during a storm. Jesus, as we heard in the children's sermon, is asleep at the back of the boat, seemingly unaware that the disciples are struggling to stay alive. As the boat fills with water, as the disciples are bailing water out of the boat, as they do everything that they can, their teacher, their leader, their master is asleep. He's out. It almost seems absurd. How can Jesus sleep through a storm like this? Surely it should wake him up. Surely no sleep is deep enough to last in the midst of waves pelting you and water pooling around your body as you're laying there on the cushion. And Jesus is the disciples' teacher. He's their leader. Why isn't he leading them against this storm? Or at the very least, why isn't he helping them? He should be with his disciples, getting the water out alongside them. But no, he is asleep, and he doesn't seem to care about anything that's happening. Care is an interesting word. That's what we hear in our gospel lesson, that word of care. What does it mean to care about something? We generally think of care being a special kind of interest that people have for something. So I can say that I care about the Buffalo Bills, the professional football team that represents where I'm from. I watch their games. I'm very happy when they win. I get really upset if they lose. I am affected by what happens to the Bills. They impact my world, my schedule, my emotions, and I care very deeply for them. You can talk to Elizabeth and find out that. But when it comes to the Bills, my care for them does not impact their success as a football team. I might like to think that when I shout at the TV and give my unsolicited advice to the coaches and players, it actually does something. I like to think that somehow my care for the team causes something to happen. But it seems strange to invest so much time and energy into something that you can only watch, and you have no power to change anything of it. Yet I continue to care. I continue to have this emotional investment in something I have no power over. Now, caring for a football team is pretty low on the list of things that are worth deeply caring about. And I say that in full knowledge that I am in the South where football is king in many ways. But there are many things that are much more important to care about. And we care about our jobs, we care about our communities, our health, our family, our friends. There are lots of important things that we pay a special interest in. And there's a lot of things that we are concerned about, which is another form of care. We are concerned about things that we see in the news, about hard things that we hear about in the lives of others, hard things that are happening in our lives. There are lots of things that we care about. There are lots of things that we are concerned about. And when we care about these important things, there's an understanding that our care for something is going to prompt us to do something. So prompt us to work for the betterment of whatever thing we have. So if we care about a job, we are expected to do everything in our power to do that job well. If we care about our community, we are expected to do everything in our power to see things improve in our community or in our city. If we care about our family, we're expected to spend time with our family, to love our family, to prioritize our family. And if we care about some form of injustice in the world, we're expected to do something about that injustice. To claim to care about something and then not do something to better whatever that thing is, that doesn't feel like care. That just feels like being the fan of a football team. You're interested, but you're powerless to do anything about whatever that thing is. Do you not care that we are perishing? That is the question that we hear the disciples ask Jesus in the storm, but it's also a question that echoes all throughout the Bible, all throughout the pages of Scripture. Throughout the Bible, many people cry out to God and ask, do you care about what is happening here? Do you care about whatever the situation is that I am currently in? It's a question that the Hebrew slaves, they ask in Egypt, and the Israelites, they ask when they're in exile in Babylon. God, do you care about what is happening, or are you asleep? There are a very pointed set of verses in Psalm 121 that say, He, God, will not let your foot be moved. He who keeps you will not sleep. Behold, he who keeps Israel shall neither slumber nor sleep. Those verses are in Psalm 121 because people wonder and still wonder if God is asleep. If God is somehow, he doesn't care about what's happening to them, and he's asleep on a cushion while the waves crash into the boat. Now, as we read our Old Testament lesson from the book of Job, the question of does God care is front and center throughout this whole book. Y'all remember the story of Job. Job is this righteous man living a very successful life. He's really crushing it. And Satan visits God and tells God that the righteous Job will curse God if all the good things in Job's life are taken away. So God permits the good things that are in Job's life to go away. His stuff gets taken, his children die, he's afflicted with these terrible sores. And despite all of these things, Job doesn't curse God. But that's just the first 2 chapters of the book of Job. And that's what we normally think of when we think of the book of Job, is those terrible things happening to Job. And then at the end of the book, Job getting all of those things back in some way. But our reading this morning that we get is chapter 38. And there's a lot that happens between chapters 2 and chapter 38. So in those in-between chapters, Job and his 3 friends try to make sense of what's happening to Job. And a lot of the conversation revolves around the justice of God. Job and his friends, they have not been privy to the conversations that have happened between God and Satan. They don't know why Job is experiencing these terrible things, but they're trying to make sense of it all. And as they try to make sense of Job's situation, we're getting this interesting exploration into the age-old question of why bad things happen to good people. And Job's friends, they give a very popular answer to that question. They think that these terrible things that are happening to Job are happening because Job has sinned in some way. In their schema of how the world works, God is just, and he orders creation. He makes sure that creation works towards justice. And if something appears unjust, it must be caused by an individual person messing up the whole system of how things work. So Job must have sinned. Job doesn't like this answer because he believes himself to be righteous. And for the most part, he is righteous. Job is not a book that portrays Job as some kind of prideful, pious do-gooder who deep down is just as sinful as everybody else. Job is a fairly good man. So Job thinks his friends are wrong. He thinks that he is entirely innocent, and although he knows that God is supposed to be just, he thinks that God is wrong. So in short, Job thinks that he's innocent and God is unjust. Well, next up in the book of Job is this figure of Elihu. Elihu is this strange figure who just kind of shows up in the middle of the book of Job and suggests to Job another option. Elihu thinks that Job's friends are a bunch of dunces, and he thinks that Job is wrong to say that he is entirely blameless because, well, Job is a human being. For Elihu, there might be a different reason behind Job's suffering than Job's sin or God's injustice. Perhaps the suffering has a purpose. Maybe the suffering will protect Job in some way from maybe the dangers of riches, or maybe it will make him better as a person. It's here with Elihu's words that we see the roots of a Christian understanding of suffering as a formative experience, something that we see throughout the New Testament, something that we see especially in the letters of Paul. Now, Elihu, he says his piece, and then he disappears. And Job is the one who kind of gets his final words in this section. Job concludes the section. He's mad, he shouts at God, he continues to assert his innocence, and under all of this is the fundamental question of God, do you care? Do you care about what is happening to me? Now, we said that to care about something is to show special interest in something, but to also do all in your power to help whatever that thing is. The expectation that Job has for God is that God should care, and God does have the power to change his situation. And that's an important thing. When people ask God, do you care? There's this assumption that God should care, but also that he has the power, the capacity, the strength within himself to actually do something about a situation. And so it's a really difficult question to wrestle with. Of God, you have all this power, you have this ability. Why aren't you acting in this situation? Why aren't you acting the way that I think you ought to be acting? And so Job thinks, that God is powerful. He thinks that God is there, but he also thinks that God is unjust, that God doesn't care about what's happening in his life. And after Job's final protest, after he makes this final kind of like claim about himself and about God's injustice, we hear the words from our Old Testament lesson. It's the first time that we hear God speak throughout the entire book of Job. And what is it that God says? Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Dressed for action like a man, I will question you, and you make it known to me. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determines its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? On what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone? When the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy. God looks at Job, he looks him square in the eye, and he points to all of creation. He points around Job. Consider everything that is around you, Job. Consider the earth and the stars and the sea. Where were you when they were made? Were you there? No, you weren't. Of course not, you were there. You are not the creator. I am the creator. God takes Job by the hand, and he shows him the complexity of everything that is. And that's most of what we get from God at the end of the book of Job. God shows Job the complexity of creation, and he asks Job, can you understand all of how this works together? Can you be the one to run creation? And Job, seeing all of this, promptly sits down, repents, and recognizes his limited viewpoint. Job doesn't know everything that God knows, and he has to trust that God is just in the midst of a sinful and broken world. He has to trust that God does care, and trust is where the book of Job ends. So does God care? Job says yes, although that care can look mysterious at times. What does the teacher asleep in the boat say? The disciples, they shake Jesus awake, and they ask him, Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? And I wonder what the disciples are thinking Jesus would do if he did care about what was happening, if he did care that they were perishing. They don't seem to think that he will calm the wind and the waves because they're very surprised when he does that at the end of the passage. I think that they want him to help. They see him as another man in danger of drowning on the boat. They think that he should care and at least help bail out the water as it's coming into the boat. And so they call on him to help. And what does Jesus do? He wakes up, he rebukes the wind, and he says to the sea, Peace, be still. Jesus does care, and the creator of the world, and the creator of the wind and the waves, he calms the wind and the waves. He cares, and he has the power to change things. And even as the disciples struggle, Jesus meets them in their struggles and calms the storm. When the disciples shake Jesus awake, what is the first thing that he says? Peace, be still. He doesn't scold the disciples. He meets them in their need, and he does something. So does God care? Is God awake? Is God powerful enough to do something about whatever situation I am dealing with? Job tells us that God does care, but that we don't have the mind or the wisdom of God. We can't run creation. And our reading from the Gospel of Mark tells us that God is stronger than the wind and the waves, and that he does care for those terrified disciples. But our gospel lesson tells us one more thing, and Carol noted this, is that Jesus is in the boat with the disciples. He isn't watching them from afar. He's there inside the boat. When Jesus took on flesh and dwelled among us, he entered into the storm with us. He cared that much that he entered the storm. He entered into the chaos. And while we try our hardest to prevent a boat filling with water from sinking, while we try to fix our lives, while we try to clean ourselves up, while we try our hardest to be better, Jesus is there in the boat alongside us. And it is his voice, and it is his voice alone, that calms the chaos around us, the chaos that's in our hearts, and the chaos that's in our lives. So does Jesus care? Does Jesus care? It can be really hard to think that Jesus does care sometimes. In the midst of things that we are experiencing, when things feel super chaotic in what's happening in our lives, that is the question that is at the forefront of our minds, is do you care about anything that's happening right now? So does Jesus care? He does care. He took on flesh because he cares. He died on the cross because he cares. He rose again because he cares. He ascended to the right hand of the Father because he cares. And he makes intercession for us now because he cares. Jesus cares for us. And our call as disciples is to trust him. And that's where all of this ends, is at faith. Faith is our response as disciples to know that Jesus is going to wake up and that he's awake right now, and he's going to do something, that he's done something about how we're perishing, but he's going to do something one day about the perishing that we experience. So our call is to trust him in the midst of all of that. And faith is a complex thing. It's a difficult thing. But as Christians, it is all our call. And so do we have a God who cares? We do. Do we have a God who's powerful? We do. And so we are those disciples in the boat. And God is the one speaking into the chaos, telling us, peace, be still. Amen.